Okay, so here are some of the configurations. Here are the configurations that we're going to use on the switch to defend against some of these types of attacks, and basically to configure the switch for optimal security scenarios. So we're going to go through some of these commands right here, and you can see I've got a list here of commands that we're going to use, and we're going to use them in Packet Tracer mostly on this switch right here, S1. So we're going to work with S1. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to cover the management controls, access control of the switch. I'm not going to go into passwords and user accounts and remote access. I've done that in previous videos. What I'm going to focus on is this area down here, the VLAN security, layer 2 protocol security, and switch port security. All right, let's get started. In Packet Tracer, what we're going to do is we're going to try to run through this list. We're going to basically apply a level of security by essentially running through this list and then putting in the commands necessary to do these steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I'm going to go into switch 1. You can see that switch 1 right now, we've got 3 users attached to the switch on fast Ethernet 01, 02, and 03. Each one of these users is going to be a different VLAN. Okay, and then we have 2 gigabit ports here that are going to be used for trunk links that are going to connect to other switches. So we have a scenario here where we have a situation where we have multiple switches and we have the potential for loops. So spanning tree protocol needs to be used to shut down switching loops here. So let's go into the switch and start doing some of these commands. Now we'll open up the switch. I'm going to go to command line mode here, and you can see I don't have any access control on the switch, no password set, so I'm not dealing with that this time. What I will do though is change the host name to S1 so that you can see that it's S1 that we're dealing with, which is this switch right here. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show VLAN, and I want to do that of course from privileged mode though. Show VLAN, and to take a look at our VLANs, and you can see that by default all of the ports FA01, including the 2 gigabit ports, they're all in VLAN 1, which is the default VLAN. So by default all these ports are in VLAN 1. Now also the native VLAN is in VLAN 1 and the management VLAN is in VLAN 1. Management control information is sent over VLAN 1. So these are the defaults, and what we want to do is an attacker would know that, hey, if this switch has not been configured, everything's in VLAN 1, I can attack management through VLAN 1. So what we want to do is we want to change this so that not all of these ports are in VLAN 1. And I'll show you something else. If we do a show interfaces switch port, I did a show interfaces tab, SW tab to get to switch port, you can see that right here, and starts off with port 1 here, fast Ethernet 01, that the port is enabled by default, and administrative mode, it's in dynamic auto mode. So it is in an auto negotiation mode, and it could turn into a trunk. So if we basically sent it 802.1q or dynamic trunking protocol DTP information, this port could switch into a trunk right now. And you can see here that the encapsulation, it has .1q configured. It's got native VLAN. It's got negotiation of trunking is on, so it could basically turn into a trunk, and then it could be used to attack the network. It's in VLAN 1, native mode VLAN, you can see is also 1, trunking native mode VLAN 1. So we need to deal with that. So that's what we're going to deal with first. So I'll hit Control C to exit out of that mode, and now I'm in privileged mode. I'll go to global config mode, conf T, and now I'm in global config mode, and what I'm going to do is I'll say interface, or short for interface, int range FA0/1 through 24, and that puts me into config interface range mode, and so now I'm configuring all 24 Ethernet ports. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say switch port mode access, and now I've manually configured the ports for access mode. So now they're in user mode, access mode. Now they're not going to turn into trunks essentially, right? So just to verify that, if we do Control C and then go back and do Show Interfaces Switch Port, you'll see that administrative mode now is now static access, operation mode static access, and negotiation of trunking is off. So just by doing that, we create it so that these ports, and do Control C again to get out of that, cannot jump into trunking mode. Now I'm going to go back Conf T into global config mode, and I'll go in interface range port 01 to 24 again. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, after I've done that, I'm going to say switch port access VLAN, and I'm going to put them all into VLAN, let's say 22. All right. And you can see that I didn't have a VLAN 22, so it actually created it on the fly. Now, you might be saying, well, why did he put it in VLAN 22? We have VLAN 10 and VLAN 20 and VLAN 30, but by default what I want to do is I want to manually configure all user ports as access ports, and then I do not want to use the default VLAN or VLAN 1. So I'm going to put all of the ports on the switch into an unused VLAN. So essentially VLAN 22 is going to be used for my unused ports, right? So for unused ports, we're going to use VLAN 22. So now what we want to do is we want to disable CDP on all ports also. CDP is useful if you have a situation where your clients are using voice over IP and they've got, let's say, VoIP phones. So then you'd have a phone attached to the switch port, and then from that phone you could attach your computer. So in that case, CDP could be pretty useful for getting necessary information from, let's say, the Cisco phone to help configure it. If we're not using digital phones here, voice over IP phones, Cisco phones, then we're just going to disable CDP. So we'll go back in here and let's do that, right? So let's do a quick question mark here, and we see here CDP, right? We can see some of the commands here that we can use. So we could say no, or we could say CDP and then a question mark, and then there's CDP enable, right? We don't want to enable it, so we're not going to do that. So we'll say no and then a question mark, and then there's CDP and then a question mark, and then enable. So no CDP enable, and that's going to shut down CDP. Let's just double check that against our command list here. No CDP enable. Okay, so the next two commands that we're going to do are spanning tree port fast and spanning tree BPDU guard enable. So it's recommended that if you have access ports, right, and these are access ports right here, the ports that on this switch that attach to these users are called access ports, right? We put them into access mode as opposed to the ports that go from switch to switch, which are trunks, right? So these are access ports, and it's recommended that you enable port fast on all those access ports. Now what's that going to do? Port fast is going to allow the ports to go from essentially a blocking mode or disabled mode essentially to a forwarding mode and skipping listening and learning mode, right? And we don't really need to have them listen and learn because they're not going to be receiving information from other switches. Negotiations, let's say root bridge negotiations on a trunk port from another switch, bridge protocol data units, BPDUs. In other words, so they don't really need to listen because there's no other switch on the line talking to them. So they can go immediately into forwarding mode. They don't necessarily need to do a lot of listening and learning. So what we can do is spanning tree, and then we'll do a question mark, spanning tree port fast. We can see, is there another command we need? Put a question mark, disable, right? No, we want to enable it, right? And these are not trunks, so we're just going to do spanning tree port fast, right? We get a warning that port fast should only be used for ports that are going to be used in access mode, right? Well, we're putting this on all of our ports right now, or at least all of our fast Ethernet ports, because we're not using them as trunk ports right now. So we're envisioning them all being, let's say, access ports. And then what we'll do is we'll say spanning tree, and instead of port fast, we'll do a question mark here, did an up arrow, spanning tree, and this time we're going to do BPDU guard. And BPDU guard, and then we'll put a question mark, and we're going to need to do enable. Okay, so spanning dash tree BPDU guard enable. So after we do the spanning tree port fast command, we do the spanning tree BPDU guard enable command. And what's that going to do? That is going to say, hey, well, we're putting on all of our access ports port fast, which will enable us to jump straight to forwarding mode, skipping listening learning. And with the BPDU guard, what that will do is it will enable it that if an attacker was to, let's say, mangle packets and try to pretend to be a switch and try to send us BPDUs, bridge protocol data units, which are used in STP, right, for establishing who is the root bridge or the root switch in STP negotiations, right? If this guy becomes an attacker and tries to send us funny packets, right, with BPDUs in them, then when it hits the port, we've got BPDU guard enabled, it will shut down the port. It'll say basically, hey, we're not supposed to receive BPDUs on this port, we're shutting you down. This is an attack. This attacker could try to basically mangle packets and send those to us, or the computer could try to, let's say he has his own switch and try to drop a switch onto the network and try to send trunking information across, right? Try to establish himself as the root bridge, right? And we don't want that to happen because this is supposed to be an access port, not a trunk port. So we defend against that by using this BPDU guard command. So if we look at our switch, we've entered that command. The last thing that we can do is we could also just then shut down all those ports, right? So now we've actually shut them down. So if we now go do a Control C, go to privilege mode, and do a show run, our running config, you can see that fast Ethernet 01 is part of VLAN 22, which is unused. It's an access port. It's not in auto mode. CDP is not enabled. Spanning tree is in port fast. BPDU guard is enabled, and it's shut down. So now these ports are shut down, and they're also configured in a more secure posture. And that's kind of what we wanted, right? Now that we've shut everything down and we've basically put all these ports into VLAN 22, what we want to do now is configure specifically ports 1, 2, and 3 for their respective VLANs, and that's what we're going to do next.